All right, we're doing section 11.3, graphing linear functions. Make sure you write down your vocabulary here, linear function, x-intercept, y-intercept. Put those in your notes. Be familiar with those so that you can do those on the vocabulary test later on. And let's start with this first example. And what we're talking about is, remember we talked about how we could have functions and we could have them with x and y, and so we're not going to do the f of x stuff right now. We're just going to use y for that. We're going to say y equals x plus 2, and we want to graph that. And probably the best way to do that is to just create a table where I'm going to put in some coordinates and figure out what I get. So if I put in, and when you do this, pick easy things. So look at here, we've got y equals x plus 2. So let's put in some simple numbers and we can get some easy things. So let's say, okay, if I put in 0, what do I get for y? I get 2. If I put in 1 for x, I get 3. If I put in 2, I get 4. Let's go negative a little bit. If I put in negative 1, I get 1. If I put in negative 2, I get 0. So all we're doing is substituting in for some value for x. That gives me a value for y. And it really doesn't matter which one numbers you pick. What you want to do is just find some ordered pairs that we can now plot on this graph. And when we get multiple ordered pairs plotted on the graph, we will then get a line that we're going to do. So let's go over and plot this. Okay, so if I want to plot those points that I put in 0 for x. So remember that this is x and this is y. And so if I go 0x, that means I'm not going to go anywhere to the right or the left. I ended up with 2 for y. So here's my first point right there. 0, 2. So I'm plotting these coordinate points. 0, 2 was 1. I then put in 1 and we got 3. So I can go over 1 and up to 3 and get that point right there. I then put in 2 and got 4. So if I go over 2 up to 4, and then I did some negatives. I did negative 1, and when I did negative 1 I got 1. So negative 1, positive 1 right there. And then I did negative 2 and got 0. And so I got that right there. And you can see that those points are making a line. And now if I've got these points and they create this line, all those 5 points are certainly answers to this particular graph of this equation, but so is every point on that line. Those are all answers to that particular graph. So that's that function, that's that linear function that we would have there, and that's what it would look like. That would be my graph. This would be the graph of y equals x plus 2. So there's my graph for that particular one. And we call a line like that, a function that creates a line, we call that a linear function. So when you have something where you have an x and a y, when maybe it adds a number, subtracts a number, or something like that, we have a linear function. So that's what we're going to work with. Now let's take a look at the next example. So let's go back to my example here. And in the next one, it talks about x-intercepts and y-intercepts. And this is important to know that when the graph crosses the x-axis, it is known as the x-intercept. When it crosses the y-axis, it's known as the y-intercept. And so if we're trying to figure out this graph and say, well, which one of these it represents this graph. Which of these 4 choices that we have represents this graph? So let's think about the x-intercept. We said the x-intercept crosses the x-axis. Where it crosses that is known as the x-intercept. In other words, if it crosses the x-axis, then what is the value of y at that point? Well, think about it. Let's take a look at a graph, okay? Here's my x, here's my y, and let's say this is my line right here. So here's where it here's the x-axis, remember, right? So where it crosses the x-axis is right there. Well, what is the y value, right? This y value, well, that's 0. So the x-intercept, y equals 0. So let's plug in and solve for this problem. 0 equals 3x minus 6. All right, well, let's get rid of that 6 and move it to the other side. And I get 6 equals 3x. Let's divide that by 3. And I get x equals 2. So, therefore, the x-intercept is 2. We can do the same thing for y. To figure out the y-intercept, what do you think we're going to do? We're going to put x at 0, because that's where that happens. So if I put in 0 for x, I get y equals 0 minus 6, or y equals negative 6. So there's my my y-intercept is going to be negative 6. So taking a look at these graphs, which one of them has where the x-intercept is 2? Well, let's see. X went across the x. No, not that one. Went across the x at 2. All right, so that's a possibility. Went across the x at 2. That's a possibility. Definitely not. Went across the x at negative 2. Definitely not a possibility. And then the other one is, which one, where did the y-intercept, where's my y-intercept, sorry. Y-intercept, y equals negative 6. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's negative 6. This is positive 6. So that's not the right one. So here's my answer right there. That's the that's the graph represented by y equals 3x minus 6. So you can plot this graph. You can figure this graph out just by figuring out your x and y intercepts. Remember that any 2 points on the line will work for this. So it doesn't have to be anything in particular. All right, so this is relatively simple, straightforward, I think, in that we've done some of this kind of stuff before. We've plotted points and so on. So there's not a whole lot to this. So I think that you're probably ready to go ahead and get started on some of these. But let's just take a look at a couple of these real quickly here in the practices. If we were to plot some of these things here, if we said, if we've got, let's take a look at this first graph. If we've got x minus 4, we put in x, it's minus 1 minus 4, negative 1 minus 4. What do we get? We get negative 5. So my coordinates are going to be negative 1, negative 5. That's what they're asking you to do in these graphs. So the next one, I'm putting in 1 for x. So I'm going to get 1 minus 4. Well, what is 1 minus 4? That's negative 3. That's my y coordinate. So this is going to be 1, negative 3. So that's what they're asking you to do in this box, because we didn't fill one of those out before. All right, so let's go ahead, and you should be ready to get started on section 3.